Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Douglas Boyce. Douglas writes chamber music that blends medieval and Renaissance traditions with modernist aesthetics. He's a professor of music at George Washington University. We're delighted to be with him today. First-time listeners, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're building a community of writers and artists from all walks of life, and since you're with us on this journey, we'd appreciate if you would like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover, or a guest you want us to bring on, please let us know. And for more free resources, check out the Datekeepers blog at thedatekeepers.com/blog. Thank you.
Douglas, thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to have you. Can you please tell us about you and your work?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a composer. I write a lot of chamber music. I've recently written a lot with voice or vocal music. It's all quite modernist in a bunch of ways, but I think I'll talk more about some ways that it's maybe not. I'm also an organizer. I've run an ensemble out of New York called Counterinduction for about the same period of time, which is itself an interesting project because as an artist, on one hand, we have this tendency to be very interested and very fixated on what is beautiful and what is the artistic voice that we're after. And at the same time, we have to book the hall and figure out travel mechanics and that very real world stuff. And so for me, that has also informed and shaped a lot of how I work as an artist. So I don't really think that they're two distinct things. I think they're enmeshed in an interesting way. If there's a third big category that, probably should be covered, is that I'm a professor. And so I teach a lot. I teach composition. I teach music theory. I teach a lot of music history. I teach sort of aesthetic theory. And so I don't think it's actually all that distinct from the other selves that I might be talking about. And they feed one another. I mean, some of the ways that I'm sure I'm going to end up talking about some of my work either historically or aesthetically, it comes directly only out of, but it's already entailed in the way I try to teach.
And you said that your compositions they're modernist, they have modernist bona fides. Can you tell us what you mean by that for audiences who are not as familiar with the classical music tradition? What makes your compositions modernist, and when they're not modernist, what makes them not modernist?
I think part of this is also I just finished up teaching a seminar where one of the major themes was how modernism is not what you think it is. But I, in many ways, come out of a tradition that's, from Debussy and Ravel to Bartók and Stravinsky to Ligeti to Boulez, to George Crumb. One of my teachers was a very important figure for me. And so that is how I was trained. That was a music that was, and still is, an important part of how I situate myself in some sort of narrative across the field of music. And so on the sort of the detailed level, on the experiential level, a lot of it is quite dissonant, often pretty strongly atonal. There's none of the sort of traditional chord and key structures that we're used to hearing. The rhythmic structures are much more intricate. Lots of mixed meters, lots of prime numbers ending up in your keys, in your time signatures, which doesn't really happen much for the great Viennese composers. And so there's also, I think, a certain intensity. A good friend of mine and longtime collaborator, Kyle Bartlett, composer, in hunting around for sort of what her music is most like, it's always severe. And there's an interesting tradition in that severity If you look at the ancient Greek statuary, the Germans noticed this transition that they call der strenge Stil, this moment where they start using more metal and the way they etch the faces onto the metal. Everything's just more intense. And so there's definitely those moments in my music, it's like the way that the opening of Stravinsky Rite of Spring or something like that is sort of, there's just a lot going on and it's all quite complicated. But I would say that on a deeper level, I think that I'm a modernist in the sense that I'm not just interested in things being beautiful. I'm interested in making music that is rather hard to parse. And there's a great concept from Shklovsky, Russian formalist tradition, but it shows up in other ways of estrangement. Like what it's supposed to do is make you feel strange, is make you think about the experience of listening as unfamiliar, as, and sort of awaken some sensitivity as to what's happening around you. And I think that that sort of textbook modernist severity does that in some way. But in other cases, changes in things like harmonic structure or the way a piece is organized, its formal organization, can itself also be deeply estranging. A friend of mine just listened to the first time Morton Feldman piano and string quartet piece, which is an hour plus of basically one or two chords and one tiny little figure on the piano being played in a large number of varieties, and it's not really clear that anything happens. And it is so disruptive of expectations. Listen to it hundreds of times, and it's still this sort of like, oh my goodness, what is that? So when I think about that sort of modernism, I do think about sort of very particular technical elements that are part of what I do, how my harmony is organized, how my rhythm is organized, but also that broader project of saying, well, maybe art and maybe music in a particular form of art can actually have a beneficial disruption of expectations and norms, not just because they are disrupted, but something about the manner in which they are disrupted increases the consideration of the multidimensionality of music's existence.
How did you end up becoming a composer? Did you have a family member who is or was a musician?
Well, that's actually one of the reasons that I'm interested in this particular form of music. My mother had been an amateur but well-trained soprano singer and opera singer, and she sang in local productions. And there was music in the house. And we all sort of studied piano. And I think as the youngest of four, my lack of enthusiasm, I kind of got away from that and sort of didn't really advance. And by fourth or fifth grade, I wasn't studying anything. And oh my God, I remember a terrible experience with my sixth grade chorus teacher. We were singing at the local library, and she told me to not sing and to mouth all the words because I wasn't singing in tune. And so I had this sort of terrible, terrible sense that I couldn't possibly be a musician. I had been tagged, I'd been identified as outside of that. And it was not until halfway through my freshman year, I got a copy of the Talking Heads film, Stop Making Sense. And it was absolutely astounding to me. Like, I just could not, the way it was stitched together, the way it unfolded over time, the way the ensemble grew over the course of it, I was just fascinated. And so kind of late in the game, all of a sudden I was like, I'm interested. And I started, my mother had already tried to restart me on piano. And suddenly I got interested. And I was actually practicing, I was actually doing it. So I put together, as was sort of the right thing to do. I grew up in New Jersey where, as you drove down the street, every fourth garage had a band in it. Because we were deep in Springsteen country. And so that's what you were supposed to do. And so I got together this very funny, strange little punk band, and we started playing, and we played gigs and played in New York. There's a whole other side story of we were briefly famous in Japan and toured in Japan and came back. But upon returning, still played at the same terrible bars that we played at before. Did absolutely nothing for us.
What's that song, Big in Japan? Is that Eurythmics?
That is not our song. It should have been. It should have been. It's about two weeks of my life. But along that way, one of the beautiful things about punk as a sort of an origin story is that you don't have to be able to play. We started writing songs in part because we couldn't figure out other people's songs. So we had to come up with something of our own to write it. So by the time I went to college, I was very interested and active. I still was far from thinking myself as a musician, someone who could become a musician on a professional level. I was a physics major, and I was very serious about that and loved it and still loved it. And there's, tremendous clarity of thinking. But at the same time, I was very lucky. I was at a place where you could really, maybe not easily double major, because not all the majors, I don't mean that all the majors were easy, but that there were few impediments to taking on different degrees. And I just was taking so many classes in the music department anyway. I was like, I guess I'll double major. And it really wasn't until my junior year that I was sort of like, I don't know which is the way I should be trying to go. I had advanced quite quickly in a lot of ways in music. I had a whole bunch of deficits that needed to be filled just in sort of core training. But again, along that way, I think as I became more capable technically, but also more aware of the wide varieties of kinds of music that are happening. At first, I became very interested in jazz, and I played in college. I played a lot of jazz, but then again, increasingly interested in that modernist tradition in European art music. And yet, I actually think that my description of the severity and the estrangement that I'm assigning to all of this fancy pants modernist concert music, I think that's very much what at that moment was happening in the punk tradition. Very different technical means, very different, structures by which it happens, but it's the same sort of how can we disrupt things in such a way that new things can happen.
That's a really interesting parallel. And I'm curious, because you did kind of allude to it, like part of the reason that happened was that a lot of the punk musicians were people who couldn't play in traditional ways. I mean, I'm thinking of Sid Vicious. The guy couldn't play to save his life. The Pere Ubu guitarist, I think he played guitar for 30 years, and then one day he found out he was tone deaf. So, but like, how do you distinguish between people who are actually incompetent and don't have a vision and are just trying to mask their incompetence versus someone, I mean, you mentioned Talking Heads too. David Byrne was always like a little bit off key, and yet it works because he had a broader vision for what he was doing. So how do you know when you're engaging with the work of someone who is just trying to use their rebelliousness to mask a deeper incompetence versus when you're dealing with someone whose work actually has a transcendental quality, even if they're missing some technical skill that is usually ascribed to the people in their tradition?
I think one of there's some great documentary film about the history of punk. And there's this conversation with Chrissie Hynde. And, a lot of people forget the degree to which she was there in the earliest days. She rose in, notability later. And in some ways in that kind of that post-punk moment, but she was there quite early on. And in this interview, she said, but it's something along the lines about how punk was very free and who could begin to participate in it. But if you look at the people who came out of it, and I think she's a fine example of this, you develop those skills. You develop some cogency, and that almost always leads to competence, right? Leads to some skills. And I think you see it in the tradition, by the time punk evolves to bands like Fugazi or Bad Brains, those are great players doing really interesting things, not all the standard things, right? But there's a development of a desired skill set. And oftentimes that pulls people out of that tradition. So for me, that description of punk is interesting to see it as a starting point. When you start thinking about the corpus, the life projects of artists, the point of origin is of less interest to me, per se, than how that body of work, how it suggests its own fittingness into life. The talking heads are interesting because you can see these shifts that happen, often with personnel who's really on board as a collaborator, which is why once you have Bernie Worrell and those players from that era, it's a very different sort of space. Looking at King Crimson and seeing these shifts that happen. Now, that's an interesting case where Robert Fripp had a very distinct way that he thought guitar should be played and what that guitar was supposed to sound like. There's tremendous cogency throughout that arc. I think that's relatively rare in pop music traditions. I think because they're operating within a marketplace. People either jump into a different space or evolve into a different space. It's like starting over. This might be one of the things that I was particularly interested in art music, that you look at Beethoven or Stravinsky and you can talk about these three phases in their work. And you look at Brahms and you can't. It's just sort of stable. Now, in that stability, that itself is interesting and it evolves in really microscopic ways, but there's not these sort of these shifts. So to step back to your question, I think I remember it right about punk and who knows who's in and who's not in and who's faking and who's not faking. In some way, who's in it as a business, in my mind, or who's in it to be in the position of the person who's in the band, rather than to be in the band, but to be the person that is in the band. I think that unfolds over time.
Can you talk about your process of composing? What's that process like?
I'm very interested in history, in historical music. I joke with my students that you listen to some music from 1350s in France, in Burgundy, and you can come away with the sense that it's been downhill since then. I think there are many, many ways in which things are much better than they were, but there's such richness in a particular moment in history. And in some ways, the distance from us is actually itself generative, because we have to think about it. We have to think about those differences. And so one piece that I'm talking about recently as a sort of exemplar of how I work is a piece called Dit de l'Alérion, which is the story of the tale of the Alérion, a mythical bird that shows up in a lot of medieval texts. And if I were to describe the work, I would say it's one of these pieces that is in some ways classical and in some ways modern. It's a piece for clarinet and classical guitar and cello. And so it's okay, they're acoustic instruments. They're instruments that we might think of more in that, especially cello, in sort of that environment than in other environments. It's a long work. It's about half an hour, something like half an hour. And so that itself is also, that's one of those things that classical music does. It's in multiple movements, which is again also another part of that tradition. It's in 11 movements, which is a little bit strange, but if you listen to it, it's a lot of very dissonant harmony that's in it. There's these sort of very intricate rhythms, very complicated rhythms, and they're complex in and of themselves, but also the way the performers are playing together is very intricate. So I think it sort of fits some of that severity. It also, things are organized in sufficiently different ways with some different sounds coming out of instruments and people are using, not as much as in some people's music and not as much as in some music, but that's happening. But the groupings in the organization is sort of strange. But at the same time, while it is this thing very much of the century, it is also a setting of, or a reframing or a meditation on a 14th century poem by Guillaume de Machaut about sort of a sad little tale about a wannabe falconer, and he's trying to find the best bird, and it's him trying to be a falconer with different kinds of birds, and some go well and some don't go well. And luckily, in the end, the best bird that he had, who flew away at some point, returns, and they're sort of together, and it's going to be wonderful. So from our vantage point, it's a very strange poem. It's sort of written as if it's dealing with, like it's courtly love. The relationship of the falconer and the bird is this interestingly intimate. There's a lot of reflection on what does it mean to be a falconer? Why do people want to have these falcons? How do they relate? There's social dynamics of this young guy interacting with these older specialists, and so each movement is sort of a reflection on one of the parts from this story, sort of almost like a bunch of tapestries, sort of portraying a little image of what's going on with the different birds and the different people that he meets on his adventures. Again, 12th, 13th, and 14th century music was a big part of my training, big part of my doctoral work. And in some ways, there are these sort of technical elements, some logic of how it's put together that's very much from that century. And the text, as you read it, kind of forces you to go back and say, okay, let's pretend it's 1360. This is happening. Let's try to figure out what's going on. And at the same time, in the surface details, in the events of the actual event of the music making, it is all of this strange modernist sound. I love that contrast between either traditional structures or deeply ancient structures and much more modern structures. I think because it calls into the foreground the degree to which all of these things are contingent on our experience, just our experience, period, but in particular cases, our experiences as listeners, as artists, as musicians. It doesn't always have as strong a historical element, but that sort of play of how can contrast occur, but not just through juxtaposition, but they become integrated.
Do you have any advice or anything else that final note that you want to end on?
I think you framed this podcast in this really nice way, thinking about what is a new Renaissance? How do we sort of rethink things? And for me, and again, in a funny way, this will sort of walk back to my dear old punk days. I think that even in music as esoteric as this, that oddness, that ill-fittingness, that estrangement is itself, I think, resistance in some ways of the dominant paradigms of music in a marketplace, of art as a commodity. And I think that kind of thinking, unfortunately, culturally, I think we're experiencing some of the consequences of that kind of thinking. And any piece that, along with its beauty or its strangeness or its severity, makes you think about that question. Why is this? Why is this here? How did this come to be? What does it suggest about other kinds of music? That alone, I think, is a strong position of resistance to a flattening out of our experience of life, and a flattening out of our experience of art. There's a great, wonderful thinker who I love named Bernard Stiegler, who has written a lot and some beautiful essays and books sort of around this idea of the proletarianization of sensibility, where our experience of life, unfortunately, so often excludes something like art. And sometimes I think to call attention to it, it's got to be kind of weird. It has to not fit, because if it fits, it's just part of this prevailing mechanism. So if that were my one takeaway, my hope for a takeaway was how music can, on a good day, be beneficially disruptive of people's experience of other music.
Love
of art
that.
in general, and maybe life.
Yeah, that's great.
That's great. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you. Thank you so much for making the time and for sharing.
No, thanks so much for having me. I as I said, I'm really inspired by what you're doing with all of this.
Thank you.
It was great talking to you. Really enjoyed it.